Viewer discretion advised. Before we begin, I want to inform you that this episode will cover sensitive and potentially triggering topics, including domestic violence, child abuse, racism, specifically related to the Nazi regime, suicide, rape, and murder. Please be mindful, as viewer discretion is strongly advised. Now let's dive into the heartbreaking story of 7-year-old Anna Bachmeier, whose tragic murder led her mother to seek out her own form of justice. The Bacha family originally fled from East Prussia. After World War II, when the region fell under new control, they relocated to West Germany. This is where the story of Marianne Bachmeier begins. She was born on June 3, 1950, in a refugee camp near Hanover, entering a world filled with hardship and turmoil from the very start. Her family was extremely strict and deeply religious. Her father had a troubling past. He had been a soldier in the Waffen-SS, the combat branch of the Nazi paramilitary. For context, the Waffen-SS started as Hitler's personal bodyguards, but later became infamous for operating concentration and extermination camps. These soldiers were indoctrinated with racial hatred, trained to be merciless, and taught to never surrender, no matter the cost. Growing up in this environment must have been unbearable for Marianne. Not only was her father a former Nazi, but he was also an abusive alcoholic who became violent when drunk, which was often. Although he spent a lot of time out at the pub, providing brief moments of peace in the household, his return often meant chaos and terror for the family. While we don't have concrete evidence of physical abuse toward Marianne or her mother, the sources we found depict a deeply disturbing and toxic household dynamic. As Marianne's childhood progressed, her parents eventually divorced. Sadly, her mother remarried a man who was, in many ways, an even greater nightmare than her biological father. He was domineering, erratic, and extremely particular. One of his many obsessions was maintaining a perfectly pristine garden. In fact, he was so strict about it that he forbade young Marianne from playing in her own backyard. Despite growing up in such a harsh and controlling environment, Marianne remained a free spirit. No matter how much she clashed with her parents or how hard they tried to mold her, Marianne stayed true to herself. She often rebelled in small ways, like refusing to call her stepfather Papa. Instead, she insisted on referring to him as Uncle Paul. It may have seemed like a minor act of defiance, but it was significant in her household, where control and obedience were expected at all costs. This simple refusal enraged her stepfather, who began to physically abuse her. From that point on, violence became a constant presence in Marianne's life. While we don't know for certain if her biological father had been abusive, it was now confirmed that her new stepfather was. Even worse, her mother often sided with the men in her life, leaving Marianne feeling isolated and unsupported. In search of love and companionship, Marianne turned outside of her home. At 15, she entered her first serious relationship with a boy named Herman. But what she loved most about him wasn't necessarily him, it was his moped. To her, the moped symbolized freedom, a way to escape the strict, suffocating rules of her home. Marianne kept the relationship a secret from her parents, knowing how furious her stepfather would be if he found out. Living in such a strict household, she was bound by an 8 p.m. curfew, even as a teenager. To be with Herman, she had to sneak out of the house late at night, sometimes using a teddy bear tucked into her bed as a decoy. She'd then climb out the window, and the two would spend hours riding through the night on his moped. At 16, Marianne found herself pregnant with Herman's child. It must have been an incredibly terrifying experience for her, still so young and with no supportive family to turn to. As expected, when her parents found out, they were furious. It's unclear exactly how they discovered her pregnancy or whether Marianne told them directly, but the outcome was devastating. She was kicked out of the house, with many sources suggesting it was her stepfather who threw her out. However, there are also reports that it may have been her own mother, who had consistently prioritized the men in her life over her daughter. Marianne's mother may have seen her as an obstacle, someone who was causing problems in her marriage, and chose her husband over her own vulnerable, pregnant teenage daughter. Regardless of who was responsible, Marianne was left alone and homeless at 16, pregnant and abandoned by the very people who should have cared for her the most. Now homeless and without anyone to support or care for her after being kicked out, it's unclear exactly where Marianne went. However, it's likely that she found herself in one of the many homes for unmarried mothers that were common in the 1900s. These institutions existed because it was considered shameful for a woman to have a child out of wedlock, and they were often run by religious groups, charities, or even the state. Their purpose wasn't so much to help the women, but to hide them away until they gave birth, usually with the expectation that they would give their babies up for adoption. The conditions in these homes were incredibly basic. There were strict routines and little to no emotional support, leaving Marianne to navigate her pregnancy in isolation. In 1967, at just 16 years old, she gave birth to a baby girl and, heartbroken, put her up for adoption. Despite always wanting to be a mother, Marianne knew this wasn't the right time. She was too young, with no stable home, no family support, and no means to provide for a child. It was an incredibly brave decision, though likely one she felt forced into by her circumstances. As for the baby's father, Herman, he stayed with Marianne through most of the pregnancy, and she continued attending school, despite her situation. However, after the baby was born and given up for adoption, Herman distanced himself from her. What makes this even more painful is that Herman had once talked about wanting to marry her. In fact, he even mentioned buying an engagement ring. But his father's advice, infamously crude and misogynistic, was, if you want to drink a pint of milk, you don't need to buy the cow. And with that, any dreams of a future together quickly faded. About a year after giving up her first child, Marianne started dating again and soon found herself pregnant a second time, now at the age of 18. She was still too young, still without a stable home, and this time the father of the baby was a squatter, homeless and unable to provide for himself, let alone a child. In desperation, when Marianne was heavily pregnant, she and her boyfriend broke into her family's house while her mother and stepfather were away on holiday. They squatted there for a short time, but things took a terrifying turn when one of the neighbors, who had been watching Marianne closely, broke into the house and raped her at gunpoint. She was alone, vulnerable, and heavily pregnant. Despite his threats to kill her if she reported him, Marianne bravely went to the police. The man was arrested and sent to trial, where he tried to justify his crime by claiming that Marianne was asking for it. Thankfully, the court didn't buy his excuse and he was sentenced to prison, though rape sentences in Germany at the time were shockingly short, typically around 2 years. Given the violent and horrific circumstances, one can only hope that he served more time, though it's unlikely. This traumatic experience shattered any remaining sense of security Marianne had left. She was already feeling abandoned, and now, after the assault, her partner left her as well. Pregnant, alone, and broken, Marianne made the incredibly difficult decision to give up her second baby for adoption. After leaving school, it was time for Marianne to face the world as an adult. She found work as a waitress and managed to get a small flat, likely above the bar where she worked. The bar, called Tapasa, had a grungy counterculture vibe, attracting students, dropouts, and those on the fringes of society. At 22 years old, Marianne enjoyed this new chapter of her life. For the first time in a long while, she found herself in a social environment with a network of people who cared about her. The bar's atmosphere, infused with hippie culture, suited her free-spirited nature perfectly. Marianne was well-liked and quickly became a regular fixture at Tapasa. Soon, she began an on-again, off-again relationship with Christian, the bar's manager, a typical laid-back hippie with long, unkempt hair, a bushy beard, and mismatched, colorful clothing. Not long into their relationship, Marianne found herself pregnant once again, this time at 22. However, her circumstances were different now. She had a job, a place to live, and most importantly, she felt ready to raise a child. This time, Marianne decided she would keep the baby. She had always wanted to be a mother, and after the heartbreak of giving up her previous 2 children, she couldn't bear the thought of doing it a third time. On November 14, 1972, Marianne gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Anna. Although Christian initially promised to support her, he ultimately wasn't ready for the responsibilities of fatherhood and left. Disappointed but determined, Marianne decided she could raise Anna on her own. With this decision, Marianne realized that she never wanted to face another unexpected pregnancy again. She was done with the heartache and the difficult decisions, so in her early 20s, she made the choice to get sterilized. While Marianne had a job as a waitress at Tapasa, she didn't make much money and couldn't afford proper child care, so she often brought her baby daughter Anna with her to work. This dive bar became like a second home for Anna, who was practically raised there. Despite the rough environment, the regulars and staff adored the little girl, doting on her as if she were their own. Though Tapasa was far from an ideal environment for a child, Anna was surrounded by people who cared about her. As Anna grew, she became more and more like her mother, free-spirited and positive. The hippie culture of Tapasa clearly influenced her, giving her a unique outlook on life. But raising a toddler and later a school-aged child in a noisy, rowdy bar filled with drunk patrons wasn't easy. As Anna grew older, the atmosphere became less suitable for her. She was often left alone to entertain herself while Marianne worked long shifts tending to customers. By the time Anna was 7, she was spending most of her days in the bar. Marianne was busy and often treated her daughter like a much older child, expecting her to be independent, make her own meals, and take care of herself. While Marianne did her best, Anna was forced to grow up fast, and many saw this as neglectful. Marianne was overwhelmed, trying to balance being a mother with the demands of her job, but it meant Anna lacked a normal, stable childhood. She was exposed to adult conversations, smoking, drinking, and a world far too mature for a young child. Marianne worked night shifts, so Anna lived on a nocturnal schedule as well. When her mother came home in the early hours, she would drink with regulars and then sleep through the day, leaving Anna to fend for herself. On one particularly ordinary day, May 5, 1980, things took a tragic turn. The night before, Marianne and Anna had an argument. Afterward, Marianne slept through the day as usual, while Anna woke up and, upset by the argument, decided to skip school. That morning, she went to a friend's house, but when she found her friend had already left for school, she wandered the streets alone. It was during this time that Anna encountered a 35-year-old butcher named Klaus Grabowski. He lived close to Tapasa and may have recognized Anna from the neighborhood. He lured her into his home under the pretense of letting her play with his cats. What happened next was unimaginably horrific. Grabowski, a known sex offender, sexually assaulted and then strangled the young girl to death using her own pantyhose. He placed her body in a cardboard box and dumped it near a canal, leaving her there as if she had never existed. Anna was just 7 years old, and her brutal death sent shockwaves through the community. Klaus Grabowski had a dark past filled with disturbing crimes. He had previously been convicted of sexually abusing young girls in the 1970s and was a registered sex offender. In Germany at the time, sex offenders could opt for chemical castration as a form of treatment instead of serving time in prison. This treatment involved taking drugs to reduce libido and sexual urges. Grabowski agreed to the procedure and was released back into society, despite his criminal history. The decision to release him after this so-called treatment would later prove to be a deadly mistake. 4 years after his release, Grabowski would go on to commit the ultimate atrocity against Anna. The tragedy of Anna's death was not only a result of the actions of a disturbed individual, but also a failure of a system that trusted a repeat offender to manage his own rehabilitation. Anna's life was brutally taken from her, and her loss shattered her mother Marianne, leaving her to bear the unimaginable pain of losing a child. When Marianne woke up, she noticed that Anna wasn't home. At first, this didn't raise any alarm since Anna was supposed to be at school. Marianne went about her day, running errands and even doing a photo shoot for a magazine. By evening, however, Anna still hadn't returned. Marianne began to panic. She initially thought Anna might be playing outside or had simply lost track of time. Marianne walked through the streets, calling out Anna's name, but no one had seen or heard from her all day. By nightfall, Marianne knew she couldn't handle this alone and called the police to report her daughter missing. A search began that night and continued into the next morning, but there was still no sign of Anna. Marianne started to think Anna might have been intentionally avoiding her, upset over an argument they had the night before. She believed Anna might be hiding at a friend's house to make a point, not realizing the growing horror that was about to unfold. The police knocked on Marianne's door the next morning with devastating news. A woman had come forward with crucial information about Anna. This woman was the fiancée of Klaus Grabowski, a local butcher. The night before, Klaus had confessed to his fiancée that he had sexually assaulted and murdered a child. He described how he strangled Anna with her pantyhose in their apartment, placed her body in a cardboard box, and dumped her by a canal. Marianne was crushed by the police's revelation. The guilt she felt was overwhelming. She had been annoyed with Anna, thinking she was just playing a cruel prank by staying out, only to learn her daughter had been murdered. The last time she spoke to Anna, it was during an argument, and now she would never have the chance to make amends. Marianne's heartbreak deepened when she realized that Anna had skipped school that day because of their fight. If only that argument hadn't happened, Anna wouldn't have been wandering the streets where Klaus found her. Marianne was left to replay the endless what-ifs in her mind. What if things had gone differently? Though nothing could undo the tragedy, the fiancé's confession provided crucial evidence. The police arrested Klaus Grabowski the day after the crime, thanks to the detailed information provided. As horrifying as it was, the quick arrest at least spared Marianne from years of wondering who had taken her child. Still, having a name and a face for the monster who killed Anna only added to the pain. Klaus Grabowski led the police to Anna's body by the canal. Her small body had been carefully tied up and placed in a box. When Marianne visited the cemetery to choose a plot for her daughter, the undertaker asked her if she wanted a single or a double grave. Marianne replied, "Double, it's for Anna and me, I'll be with her soon." The loss was too much for Marianne to bear. After everything she had already endured in life, the death of her daughter was a pain beyond comprehension. On the day of Anna's funeral, the sun shone brightly, and the turnout was incredible. The entire staff and many regulars from Tapasa were there to pay their respects to the little girl who had grown up in their midst. Instead of a traditional religious service, Marianne organized a celebration of Anna's short life. A Pink Floyd song played as people gathered around her coffin in a heartfelt tribute. Meanwhile, at the police station, Klaus Grabowski was being interrogated. He admitted to killing Anna but denied sexually assaulting her. Instead, he spun a disgusting tale, claiming that Anna, a 7-year-old, had tried to seduce him. He said that when he rejected her, she threatened to tell her mother that Klaus had touched her unless he gave her money. Klaus, claiming he panicked, said he killed Anna to protect himself from the accusation. His story was revolting and full of lies. The idea that an innocent young girl could even conceive of such a plan was beyond absurd. It was a twisted attempt to shift blame and cast doubt on the truth. Marianne was already devastated by the horrific crime Klaus Grabowski had committed against her daughter, But his sickening attempts to smear Anna's reputation during his trial only deepened her pain. Klaus made false claims about Anna's behavior, accusing her of actions that no 7-year-old could even comprehend. These accusations brought back haunting memories for Marianne of her own traumatic past. When she was 18, she was raped by a neighbor who later tried to justify his crime by claiming that Marianne deserved it. Now she was forced to listen to Klaus say equally vile things about her innocent child. Despite her anguish, Marianne knew she had to seek justice for Anna, but she struggled to trust the legal system that had already failed her. Klaus Grabowski had been previously convicted of sexually assaulting 2 girls, yet he had been released, free to prey on Anna. This fact enraged Marianne, and her faith in the system crumbled. She began to contemplate taking justice into her own hands. In March 1981, Klaus Grabowski's trial began. Almost immediately, his defense team launched a smear campaign against Marianne and Anna. They painted Marianne as a neglectful mother, bringing up her job at a bar, implying she worked late hours and didn't properly care for Anna. They even mentioned Anna's occasional absences from school, as if that had anything to do with the horrific crime she suffered. It was irrelevant and cruel, but Marianne had no choice but to sit through it all. Klaus himself tried to defend his actions, claiming his treatment for pedophilia, chemical castration, had caused him to reoffend due to a hormonal imbalance. Marianne was forced to listen to his twisted excuses, each one more repulsive than the last. By the end of the second day of the trial, she had reached her breaking point. On March 6, 1981, the third day of the trial, Marianne entered the courtroom as usual. Klaus Grabowski had just been led in, sitting at his desk. Marianne, wearing a long green coat, walked close to him, fumbling with something under her coat. Then, without warning, she pulled out a .22 caliber Beretta pistol and fired 8 shots at Klaus. 6 of them hit, killing him instantly. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Some people ran in panic, fearing she might continue shooting, while others were frozen in shock. Klaus's body slumped forward onto his desk, then slid to the floor. Witnesses later recalled hearing Marianne whisper, "This is for you, Anna," before calmly placing the gun on the floor, making it clear she had no intention of hurting anyone else. She surrendered to the police without resistance. Today, it's hard to imagine how Marianne was able to bring a gun into the courtroom, but security measures were far less strict in 1981. There were no metal detectors or thorough checks. Marianne had smuggled the gun into court under her coat, completely unnoticed. In her police interview, Marianne explained that she had obtained the gun through someone she knew at the bar where she worked. She didn't name anyone, but she mentioned that she had initially acquired the gun for self-defense. After Anna's abduction and murder, Marianne felt incredibly unsafe and wanted to protect herself. She insisted that at first she hadn't planned to kill Klaus. The gun was meant for her own safety. However, during the trial, as she watched Klaus try to manipulate the narrative and tarnish Anna's memory, she lost all faith in the justice system. She felt compelled to take matters into her own hands. Although Marianne claimed she didn't originally intend to kill Klaus, police were skeptical of her story, suspecting that her desire for revenge had been growing long before the trial even began. Marianne's actions shocked everyone in the courtroom, but many understood why she did it. In 1981, security measures were much more relaxed than they are today, and no one had checked for weapons when she entered the courthouse. After her arrest, Marianne told police that she hadn't originally acquired the gun to kill Grabowski. She claimed it was for self-defense, given how unsafe she felt after Anna's abduction and murder. But it was clear to authorities that, on some level, her actions were planned. They didn't believe it was completely spur of the moment. After her arrest, a doctor evaluated her mental state. He handed her a blank piece of paper and asked her to write something. Marianne wrote, "I did it for you, Anna," and drew 7 hearts, one for each year of Anna's life. It was a poignant message revealing that her motive was crystal clear: justice for her daughter. As news of this vigilante act spread, Marianne Bachmeier became a symbol of both tragedy and defiance. The media dubbed her the Vigilante Mother, and she became a figure of public sympathy. People sent her flowers, money, and letters of support, with many parents expressing that they would have done the same thing if they were in her shoes. However, Marianne's mental health began to deteriorate while she awaited her own trial. Her doctor warned that she was at high risk of suicide, but the justice system struggled with how to handle her case. On one hand, the whole country seemed to support her, but on the other hand, she had taken a life. The courts had to strike a balance. While many believed Grabowski deserved what he got, the law couldn't openly condone vigilante justice without sending a dangerous message. When her trial finally began, the prosecution argued that her actions were premeditated, citing comments she had allegedly made right after the shooting. Remarks like, "I wanted to shoot him in the face, but I only got him in the back, and unfortunately, I only got the pig from behind." These statements, they argued, showed that Marianne had planned to kill him. Despite this, the tide of public opinion remained largely on her side. In the end, Marianne was charged not with murder, but manslaughter and illegal possession of a firearm. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison but served only 3. But as time passed, the public's adoration for Marianne began to fade. The media dug into her past, revealing that she had given up 2 children for adoption as a teenager, and worse, that her father had been a Nazi soldier during World War II. These revelations shifted the narrative, and Marianne's once heroic image began to tarnish. After her release, she tried to move on. She remarried and moved to Nigeria, working as a caregiver in a hospice. However, in her mid-40s, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Knowing her time was limited, Marianne returned to Lübeck, Germany, where she had always planned to be buried beside Anna. On September 17, 1996, Marianne Bachmeier passed away and was laid to rest next to her daughter. Even though Marianne never expressed regret for what she did, she felt that justice had been served. The courts never convicted Klaus Grabowski because he died before a guilty verdict could be reached. But for Marianne, her actions in that courtroom were justice enough. Was Marianne Bachmeier a hero or a vigilante who took the law into her own hands? That depends on who you ask, but one thing remains clear. Her story has left an indelible mark on Germany and on the world, as a mother who sought revenge for the unthinkable loss of her child.